Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today we're discussing a brand new think tank that has just launched. The Canadian AntiMonopoly Project is dedicated to addressing the issues caused by monopoly power in Canada. C.A.M.P, for short, this new think tank assists individuals and organizations in reforming Canadian competition law and produces research and policy proposals to make Canada's economy more fair, free, and democratic. Monopoly power is deeply rooted in Canada's history and in our politics. Canada is home to a number of monopolies that can leave consumers worse off and hinder innovation. How can we change that and add more competition to Canada's economy? Here today to discuss this new initiative are three of C.A.M.P's co-founders, Robin Shaban, Keldon Bester, and Andrew Cameron. Thank you all so much for joining me today, and congratulations on the new initiative. Let's start with the basics, though. Keldon, what is a monopoly? What is an oligopoly? Let's talk about the basics before we can get to that more high-level stuff.
Absolutely, and thanks for having us on. So a literal monopoly means a single firm or individual who has control over a given market. And an oligopoly is when a market is controlled by only a handful, maybe 3 or 4 firms. But we use the term monopoly more generally to talk about when corporations have too much control over a market and can protect themselves from the competition that delivers benefits to Canadians.
And I think one of the concerns around monopolies is that they can leave consumers worse off. Robin, can you give an explanation of how that happens and maybe some examples?
Sure. So when you have a market that's dominated by one firm or maybe a small number of firms, consumers have less choice. And with that lack of choice, these firms have power. They have the ability to charge higher prices for the same quality of good, or perhaps charge the same price, but decrease the quality of their product. It's like a different type of form of, taking value from consumers. And so it's really that lack of choice and that lack of freedom from the consumer's perspective that makes monopoly so terrible.
And Andrew, could you give some examples of monopolies in Canada that our viewers might be familiar with, and maybe some examples of how they have hurt consumers?
Sure. I think some of the most obvious ones are the telecom, with where we have 4, maybe soon to be 3 large players across the country. Banks are typically viewed as one. The grocery stores, like I think back to the start of the COVID pandemic when there was the Hero Pay brought in for like 3 months and then it was just canceled and gone. So banks, telecom, and grocery stores are three big ones.
And
That,
all
like
ones that we need, right? Like it's not like you can
exactly.
choose not to bank or not to buy food.
Yeah.
Keldon, what about how monopolies can stifle innovation? What can you tell us about that? And if you have any examples that our viewers might be familiar with?
Yeah, so I think the main way that monopoly stifles innovation is by removing the competitive pressure that actually pushes companies to invest and develop new and better products for consumers. So it's tough to give concrete examples because we're talking about when something doesn't happen, but there's quite a bit of evidence showing that when firms are exposed to more competition, they tend to invest more and generate more products and signs of innovation we look to, such as patents and copyrights.
Like most economically developed countries, Canada has laws designed to deal with monopoly power. In Canada, that law is the Competition Act. So, Robin, if we have these laws, why are there still all of these monopolies in our country?
Yeah, there's 2 ways you can think of it. There's 2 sort of avenues. The first is the law itself. Our law has some pretty major deficiencies that actually enable monopolies to take place in our country. In fact, under our law, it is legal to have a merger to a monopoly, and this is pretty unheard of if you compare us to other similar countries or jurisdictions. The other aspect of it is the enforcement of the act. The Competition Bureau, with its limited budget, needs to make decisions about what sort of
Right.
conduct, what sort of mergers it's going to tackle. And if it doesn't have the resources to do that, then it's not going to enforce the law to the full extent. So
Right.
there's these two sort of avenues to it.
We've got to go to commercial break, but when we come back, I want to talk about your new initiative. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing a new think tank, the Canadian Anti-Monopoly Project. So, Andrew, let's start with what is C.A.M.P, the Canadian Anti-Monopoly Project? What do you hope to achieve with this new think tank?
So one of the biggest things we want to do is bring a new voice and a new perspective to the discussion about to the competition policy discussion, because for the last 30, 40 years, it's really been dominated by institutional experts, and it's become very, very technocratic, very expert driven. Whereas historically, it's been much more open, much more democratic, much more open to all Canadians, to everybody to contribute to the discussion. So that's one thing right off the bat, is we want to bring more voices and new diverse voices into this discussion.
Andrew, is there anyone in these kind of consultations around changes to the Competition Act? Is there anyone who represents consumers' voices when it comes to monopolies? If it's dominated by institutions, I think there are a lot of institutions in this country that can benefit from monopoly power. That includes, our political leaders.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think, there's not as much or not as many people speaking for consumers, and even just regular Canadians and regular people in small businesses and small towns. So that's where we want to come in, is we want to hopefully be that voice for people, or also show people how they can find their voice and speak up about this as well, because it does impact all of us. This isn't something just off to the side that we don't all need to worry about.
Yeah, I mean, we're all consumers of something. So Keldon, what type of issues are you going to be working on and writing about at the Canadian Anti-Monopoly Project?
Well, I think in the short term, we want to focus on the government has at least announced its intention to review Canada's competition laws. So I think a big thing we want to do is to raise awareness on that, bring in a more diverse group of Canadians, as well as communicate to folks why they should care about this. Because as we've discussed, this can be quite a technical issue, but the impact is really felt when you or I go to the grocery store or try to book a plane ticket. And so, as we said, some of these things are unavoidable. And so, a big task in the near future is to make sure that consultation, should it occur, be as diverse as possible.
Robin, one of the things that C.A.M.P has expressed interest in is law reform, of making some amendments to the Competition Act. What, at a high level, are some of those changes that you'd like to see?
Yeah, so we want to be providing recommendations to all the core aspects of competition law. The two big ones being the way that we regulate mergers and acquisitions in this country, and the second major class being what we call abuse of dominance. So when you have a big dominant business or a group of businesses that are dominant, that are engaging in business practices that are intended to or are designed to undermine competition. And so this is really the bread and butter of competition law, both in Canada and elsewhere. And we want to be providing recommendations that make the law easier to enforce, that create outcomes that are more fair to various stakeholders, consumers, small businesses, and workers increasingly.
Robin, I know the Competition Act did have some recent amendments. What can you tell me about those recent changes, and if you think they're going to actually achieve this goal of making Canada more competitive?
Yeah, one of the most profound changes, I think, in the recent revisions is a new provision that makes it a criminal offense to fix wages. So previously, it was perfectly legal for businesses to sit in a smoky room together and collude to fix wages. Now, this could fall under different provisions of the Act, and the Competition Bureau tried to do this with the hero pay fiasco around the beginning of the pandemic, where grocery store executives phoned each other up and said, hey, let's lower people's wages because they had given workers a boost in light of the pandemic. And so this sort of behavior is not criminal, but it will be in the future. And this is exciting, but it also raises some questions about gaps in enforceability. I think that we need to think about a more broader, wholesome review that looks at critically these new provisions and how they fit together as a comprehensive suite of policies.
Right. When we come back, I want to talk about this recent outage at Rogers and what role that plays in the discussion around monopoly power in Canada. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing a new think tank, the Canadian Anti-Monopoly Project. So, Andrew, one of the best known monopolies that Keldon discussed in our first segment, or I guess is an oligopoly, but it's telecom. And there was this recent outage in Toronto, in Ontario, for Rogers' cell phone and internet, which was extremely disruptive for a lot of people. So what does that outage tell us about the risks of monopoly power in Canada, and how might that outage impact thinking around this proposal to merge telecom giants Rogers and Shaw?
Yeah, so that impacted me here in Nova Scotia as well. I couldn't use my cell phone for 2 days. And I think one of the things is a lot of for the mergers is people make the argument that they're more efficient, and we can debate whether that's true or not. But what happens is we put everything together, they become much more fragile. So we've created one company, Rogers, across the country, and we see them go down for a day and people can't access the internet. We can't use debit cards across the country. Like I said, think about if you're a small business and for the last 2 years, you've been just fighting to stay alive through the pandemic. And all of a sudden you wake up one day and because Rogers, something happened with their network, you can't take debit at your store, right? That exposes the fragility of when we let everything consolidate. So the fact that we're fragile, like it's a fragile system now with 4 large companies, and then we're going to let 2 of them merge. So with this outage, if Rogers and Shaw had merged before, then all the Shaw network's down as well because it's connected to the Rogers network. It just becomes even more fragile across the country.
Certainly a risk and something that a lot of people suffered from for those 2 days. It's extremely disruptive. Now, Keldon, you and Robin have both written about how reforming the Competition Act could actually help with a more recent phenomenon, which is rising inflation. So how could the Competition Act be used to achieve that goal?
Yeah, so it's important to understand that inflation is driven by a number of factors over which we don't have too much control, of course, because of global markets. But one thing that competition does at any point is really dictate how the benefits of commerce are shared between whether producers or consumers or intermediaries, and that's fundamentally a question of power. And so when your markets are more competitive and prices are rising, the companies without market power have to bear some of that cost to remain competitive, whereas a firm with market power can pass that cost on to consumers. And so what we were writing about was to say, this is not the cause of inflation. That would be an overstatement, but more competitive markets would protect, again, be a layer of protection for consumers when prices do rise.
Robin, one of Canada's unique features in our competition law is something called the efficiencies defense, which is used in mergers to justify them even when those mergers enhance or create a monopoly power. It's quite unusual in terms of international competition law, but what can you tell me about that particular defense, your view of it, and its role in Canadian competition law?
Sure. Well, I mean, its role in competition law, we can point to it and say it is the reason why we have certain monopolies in our country. And one of the best examples of this is a merger between 2 propane distribution companies in the 90s. So these companies merged, and because of the efficiencies defense, the Competition Tribunal, which is the special kind of quasi-court that hears these cases, determined that although this merger is likely to increase propane prices in several communities by about 8%, the merger is still legal because it creates very significant cost savings. So, because of this ruling, we now have, well, at the time, we had monopolies in 16 communities across Canada, and we're talking literal monopolies. So, for several of these communities, the only place you can go to buy propane to heat your home, run your barbecue, is one propane distribution company. So,
And when
it
they
has
talk about cost savings, whose cost savings are they talking about? Because certainly it's not consumers.
No, so these aren't savings that are passed down to consumers. These are savings that are enjoyed by the business. So it's about cutting that redundant infrastructure, which often means shutting off certain distribution channels and also laying off people. So we take job losses as a benefit of a merger because these job losses translate into higher profits. And it really highlights the logic of our competition law that permeates other aspects of it too. And this
Right.
is really at a core
Right.
level what we're trying to tackle.
We've got to go to commercial break, but we will be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing a new think tank called the Canadian Anti-Monopoly Project. So, Andrew, maybe you can tell me, how does Canada compare to other economically developed countries with respect to monopolies? Do we have more monopolies? Do we have fewer? And why?
So I think Canada's it's a bit more challenging in Canada, where we are a smaller country and we've had sort of more of an understanding that we thought we had to allow our companies our companies get larger to be able to compete internationally. And so justification was to let companies merge so that they could then compete with a lot of larger American companies or the European countries, or compete internationally, because we felt like our national economy is, not large enough to sustain it. So I don't have an exact answer. Maybe Robin or Keldon has that one, but I would guess we probably have more per capita than other countries.
Robin or Keldon, do either of you want to add anything to that?
I'll jump in. I'll say, it's a hard question to answer because of lack of data. In Canada, we have a real deficit in meaningful research on this topic, which again is part of our motivation for this think tank. But we do know that concentration across industries is increasing, meaning that there are a smaller number of bigger players across industries. And that's an indication that there's monopoly power accumulating across our economy.
Keldon, what are there political impediments in play in Canada that are halting or enhancing monopolies in this country? Obviously, monopolies are economically powerful, but what do we know about their political power?
Well, I think there's, two flavors of it in Canada. The first, I think we're very familiar with, and when the consultation gets rolling on the Competition Act, we'll see firms investing in lobbying and generating research that's favorable to their positions, and that's we're fairly familiar with that. But I think at a deeper level, part of the political power in Canada comes down to what Andrew was talking about, which is the idea that in order for us to be successful as a country, whatever that means, we need to, create and put up with monopolies domestically. So there's both the, as you mentioned, the economic and the sort of lobbying power. But I think at a deeper level, we need to change the thinking around, what it means to be successful as a country.
And this sort of fear that we're too small to compete, which I think so many Canadian industries that are so innovative have shown that we have the power to compete internationally without needing to build these monopolies. Robin, your project is called the Canada Anti-Monopoly Project. So what exactly does it mean to be anti-monopoly?
Yeah, well, I'll go back to the intro you gave before. Fundamentally, this is about undertaking projects and research to make our economy more democratic. So, when we talk about anti monopoly, we're talking about a state of the economy, a state of our society where we're not monopolized by private interests, where people have the ability and freedom to engage in the economy in a way that is fair and that meets our needs and provides us with opportunities for success. So it's about creating the economic foundations for a liberal and democratic society. And for us, that's really what anti monopoly is all about.
Really fascinating. Andrew, one last question. If people want to learn more about the Canadian Anti-Monopoly Project, where do they go to learn more?
Sure, you can find us on social media, on Twitter, on LinkedIn. You can go to our website. It's antimonopoly.ca.
Well, Robin Shaban, Andrew Cameron, Keldon Bester, best of luck with this new initiative. I find this subject to be incredibly fascinating. We are all consumers. And thank you for coming on today and sharing the news about your exciting new project.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for having
Yeah,
us.
thanks for having us.
Thank you. We've heard today about a new think tank called the Canadian Anti-Monopoly Project. We are all consumers of something, so we are all impacted by the power of monopolies, especially in a country like Canada. Do current laws do enough to create a competitive environment? Or are there legal and political pressures that allow monopolies to persist and thrive in our country? How can this new think tank help? You be the judge. Thanks for watching, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.